we've been doing is looking at whether online arts and culture can be useful for mental health, who it can be useful for, and what particular things about it are helpful for mental health.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I guess when everyone's interested in youth mental health at the moment, there's all this news about young people, mental health epidemic, and I guess arts, culture, museums, music, galleries, films, literature, all that sort of stuff isn't probably at the top of most people's lists of how we can help young people. Why have you chosen to focus on this as the thing?
So it really came organically from young people. So I'm a doctor and I've always been interested in young people's mental health, and I was finding that young people didn't necessarily recognise if they had a problem, didn't really necessarily want to go and see a doctor about it, and really even if they did, were a bit sceptical about medications and talking therapies. And so a lot of work goes on in saying to young people, oh, actually, how can we encourage you to go and see a doctor for your mental health? And I thought, well, why don't we turn that on its head and say to young people, actually, what does it feel like to become unwell and what would help? And actually, they were quite insightful and articulate about what would be helpful. And that's how we got here.
And so you've been funded by NIHR big time to do this big project.
Yeah, it's
Sounds
exciting.
like a lot of money to me, £2.5 million. Maybe not for a big research project over lots of years, but so tell us how you got here. You've done some kind of work during the pandemic and you've developed an online resource. Tell us about that.
So that's exactly right. So I arrived back in the UK after 20 years overseas, pretty much, right at the beginning of March 2020, with this idea that we'd look at community resources for mental health. And after getting over the fact that, COVID started and everyone went indoors, we thought, actually, why don't we adapt it and do it for online arts and culture? And it was exactly the same time that everyone was flooding to online museums. And so we said, well, why don't we just do a survey and see who's using it and how they're finding it useful? And people were finding it useful, and they were mainly white females who were quite rich. But young people were also using it and finding it useful, but they hadn't increased their use. And at that point we thought, should we do the hard thing and get people who aren't really using it to really benefit, or should we preach to the converted? And we took a risk and went to the young people and interviewed them and said, actually, would you use online museums and arts and culture more generally, and what is it that would be helpful for your mental health? And that's when we got our big surprise, because most of them, actually every single one of them, we thought they were going to say, oh, it's looking at nice pictures or relaxing or feeling distracted, and they didn't say that. They said it's hearing human stories of people across the world and across history, real people who've struggled, who've had challenges, who have found it hard to fit in, who have found difficult transitions. And they said, you know what, that just makes us feel less isolated, it gives us perspective, shifts our thoughts, lifts our mood. But the thing that surprised me, it was the human connection. And it was that they wanted to connect with people, not because of what they looked like, but because of a human experience that they could identify with. And they wanted diverse people from all over the place and across time, and they wanted to hear different people's points of view. So where we think it's uncomfortable maybe for young people to hear a different point of view, they said no, that's not the case. We do want to hear different points of view. It's uncomfortable in the moment, but it helps us shift our thoughts, lift our mood, stop black and white thinking. And so that's what we did. We said, right, well, let's look at these stories behind art and artefacts. Let's find some interesting stories. And young people were really good at helping us co-design what turned out to be ways of being.
And so what are you doing now? What's the Origin project going to do to build on that?
Well, so ways of being, we sort of had people across disciplines, and we had young people, and we did this amazing thing to make this online experience. And then we went an extra step and said, let's do the first ever randomised control trial. And we did that and found that it reduced negative thoughts. But the more exciting thing, if there could be one, was that we got much more diverse people than we usually see in mental health services, or that we usually see in research, or that we usually see in museums. And we thought, goodness, that's brilliant, that people of different ethnic backgrounds and different sexualities and different identities are using this. And it was particularly those people that said this is brilliant. I love hearing stories of people like me across time. And that's where we thought, actually, the next project, why don't we make it bigger, bolder, brighter, do similar things, but let's make it for underrepresented young people, because there's particular groups of people who are much less likely to get services, much more likely to have mental health problems, and much more likely to benefit from this sort of project.
And how are you planning to co-produce Origin with those young people?
So linking with communities, linking with young people. Young people are the best people at knowing how to get hold of other young people. So very much listening to young people about how to do it. We've got a young people's advisory group, we've got young peer researchers, and much as the same we did in OACE, which was genuinely listening. I wouldn't say I'm a particular genius, but I'm very good at listening. And it's about that, listening to young people, finding out what they want, finding out their experiences, and then making a much bigger, optimised version of ways of being for final testing in a trial. So it's similar, but much bigger in terms of finding people of diverse identities, listening to their stories, and then employing young co-designers to help us create a much bigger version of ways of being, but also think about ways of being. There wasn't much on it, so people got to the end of content very quickly, but they didn't want to be overwhelmed by content. So the idea of this is that we're going to use recommender systems and have a better way of helping people explore without feeling overwhelmed. So it's a fine balance, and then finally test it in a trial.
And if people like what they hear, this is very early on in this project, you're launching tonight, so there's not much about it online, but how can people get involved and find out more?
So this is brilliant. So we've thought of lots of ways of young people to get involved, and other people from community organisations who are interested in the young people. So there's a network of interest for people who just want to find out what's happening and if there are any opportunities. So there's a mailing list that we can give the link out to. Then there's young people's advisory groups, there's young peer researchers, and then there's of course participants, young co-designers to help us make it, and then participants for the final trial. So there are hundreds of ways of getting involved all the way through the research.
It's such an exciting project. Congratulations on getting it started, and yeah, good luck.
Thank you very much.